A very good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you to the second day of Ravenshaw Medical Humanities Symposium. The theme for today is Literature as Cure. Illness is a disruption, but books remind us that we are not the only ones in the history to face such a disruption. Books provide us with a blueprint of life in the red zone. However, in case of diseases such as leprosy, metaphorical thinking and moral opprobrium often overlap with the biomedical reality. Just as in the case of COVID-19, Mycobacterium leprae, the causative agent of the disease leprosy, rendered the patient untouchable. Leprosy patients throughout the world have been often considered as moral offenders and hence treated as social outcasts, which is why these patients often find solace by reading religious books. As we all look for an antidote in these times of COVID of self-isolation, one age-old question resurfaces. Can literature act as a cure in times like these? Further, what role has literature played in the creation of disease narratives? We have two very eminent speakers with us today, Professor Sanjeev Kakkar and Dr. Jesse Miller, who are going to talk about the different ways in which literature has been used as therapy in the past. Our first speaker for the session today is Professor Sanjeev Kakkar, who is an associate professor in the Department of English, College of Vocational Studies, University of Delhi. He is the author of Leprosy in India, The Intervention of Oral History, which was published by Routledge in 1998. He is also the author of Leprosy in British India, Colonial Politics and Missionary Medicine. He is well known for his paper, Medical Developments and Patient Unrest in the Leprosy Asylum, published in the popular journal Social Scientific. His lecture today is titled Bibliotherapy at What Cost? The Leprosy Patient in India and the Bibliotherapeutic Interventions of Caregivers, a Historical Perspective. So without wasting any more time, I welcome Professor Kakkar for the lecture.
Thank you, Shridi. So I hope I'm audible. Am I? Can you all hear me? Yes? Okay. So my talk is Bibliotherapy at what cost? Now, when we think of reading to a patient or any kind of bibliotherapy, let us be clear, it's not an innocent activity. There's always some text which is included and a text which is excluded. All right? So in the case of leprosy, this will be all the more so. All right? So I'm now looking at, in this paper, it's quite surprising. I'm a little surprised because leprosy, we know, is an unusual illness. It's always been a little more than the bacteria. It's always been more than illness. So here I will look at some specific historical periods. Okay, so I'm talking about the leprosy patient and bibliotherapy, reading to the patient, but in a historical context. So I will first start with the Christian missionaries. Now, in the period 1873 to 1910, that is the point when they dominated, they were doing the maximum intervention in India, and they had a sense of leprosy as being an ailment of the soul, for which the major therapy was reading to the patient. And I think this is one of the few instances when the primary intervention was bibliotherapy. And I will see the impact of this and the far-reaching consequences of what one might think is a simple, innocuous act. Now, just as this first generation of missionaries, to some extent, stigmatized leprosy, from about 1920, you have another generation of medical missionaries, and they secularized leprosy. So that is why I'm taking this rather broad sweep, because I want to, take this overview So what happens? What kind of institutions are we looking at, and how do they transform? And then the next section, I look at the formation of BELRA, British Empire Leprosy Relief Association in India, and how they took this work further. And after that, I'll talk a little bit about Gandhi, because I will argue that Gandhi's whole intervention in leprosy, his own institutions for leprosy, which nobody has studied, they were a response to bibliotherapy of the missionaries. And then Gandhi had his alternative bibliotherapy. So let's begin. So now I'll start with some history of medicine, which is much needed in discussions, especially of Gandhi. Let me give a context. So from 1850 to 1898, this is the period of the rise of bacteriology. This is the time when we have a scientific basis for the study of leprosy. So you would imagine that as we go down the decades, more and more people accept the bacteria, modern science, but that doesn't happen. So let me start with 1848. The modern scientific foundation for leprosy was laid in Norway by two researchers, Danielsen and Bloek, and they wrote a book on leprosy in which they said it's an illness, specific illness. There are various forms, but it's the same disease all over the world. All right? And then a few years later, also in Bergen in Norway, that's 1873, a Norwegian scientist, Amar Hansen, actually discovered the bacteria, Microbacterium leprae, which we've just heard about from Shriti. So if you expect that you have a discourse of modern medicine and everybody will follow suit, that didn't happen, because it's precisely at this time, 1873, that the Christian missionaries, the major organization called the Mission to Lepers, are founded, and they revive a biblical understanding of leprosy as sin. Now, what's going to happen? In their institutions, they will have a certain kind of bibliotherapy. And how will that impact the institution and the patients? So I will argue that this practice in an asylum of reading had vast consequences. So let me first begin with Britain. All right, so now the missionaries produced a huge volume of books, brochures, journals, magazines to spread the word and get donations. And the Mission to Lepers was founded by Wellesley Bailey. Now, how do they represent leprosy? Now, if you read any of these books, okay, a huge number of them, it's more a narrative of Christian teaching, conversions, baptisms, patients coming to God. And I'll just give you one small quotation from Wellesley Bailey. Let me see what I'm doing. Here we are. The utter helplessness and dependence of these folks on others is a continual picture of the way sinners have come to God to get his blessings. And there are lots of narrative accounts of patients saying that, now I found God and I'm a sinner and all that, which I would not take very seriously. I think these are more fictionalized. Now, what was the impact of this bibliotherapy on the reading public in Britain, the USA, Canada, who gave a lot of money, who read these books? Now, the modern study of leprosy starts with the work of an American anthropologist called Zachary Gassau. Now, what Gassau, when he read these publications, and there are patients in the USA, they were in Carlton, he was outraged and he made a charge. He said the missionaries have re-stigmatized leprosy. So this is one consequence unimaginable of bibliotherapy that, all over the world, scholars have really critiqued missionaries for doing this. Now, what did Gassau write? I'll just give you one small quotation. To a mind attuned to the Old Testament, leprosy is abomination, a matter of ritual uncleanliness. To those who believe in the New Testament, the stories of Christ miraculously curing the lepers have become metaphors for divine salvation. So, on the basis of this, a lot of modern scholarship has followed Gassau's thesis that the missionaries stigmatized leprosy. Now, what's happening in Britain, I think that this is exaggerating the impact of the missionaries and the kind of reading and the kind of teaching that they did. Now, there's a lot of studies recently on how empire impacts the domestic spaces in Britain. There's one book I can mention, At Home with Empire, Metropolitan Culture and the Imperial World by Hall and Sonia Rose. Now, they follow this and look at the impact of all these, and you can actually conclude that a large part of the white Christian population in Britain started to believe that leprosy is sin. Now, my own view here is it's more complex. I would say, number one, there were very few patients in Britain, so they are thinking about colonized people. That's the first kind of limitation. The second is that there was a great deal of bacteriology in the air in England in this time, from the 1870s to the 1890s. All the latest Norwegian researchers from India, Sir Henry Van Dyke Carter, the Leprosy Commission for India, all these things are there. And I don't think that bacteriology was completely swept aside. So I would say that what the missionaries did through their reading practices, bibliotherapy, was to somewhat create a perception that leprosy is an illness, but it's also a sin. And I'll just give you one example of the martyrdom of Father Damien, which was widely reported in the newspapers, widely in the popular press. Now, he was a Catholic missionary who died looking after patients in Hawaii. So what the public see is that a missionary dies of a contagious illness. So it's a complex thing, and I would say that it's a little bit unfair on the missionaries to generalize in this manner. Now, that's Britain. Now you come to India. Now, what happens in India is that it's a completely different context, because here there's not much audience for these publications. So if you are running an institution, which is to some extent a medical institution, and you have a notion that this is an illness of the soul rather than an bacterial disease, then you put more focus on healing the soul rather than healing the body. So what happens in colonial India, if you look from 1870s to 1920, that this fundamental assumption of the missionaries determined the nature of the institutions that they managed. Now, first point, what was the state doing? The state was very happy to wash its hands off leprosy because they didn't perceive it as a major threat. And for this, they had the census returns. So the figures are more or less stuck at around 110,000 patients. Number two, that there was this hands-off approach. Modern medicine had not really intruded into the leprosy asylums. And by 1920, most of the patients in institutional care were in homes run by missionaries. So it's very important. Now, over here, what was the impact? The focus was not on medicine. The focus was more on teaching, preaching, baptisms. Male and female patients were separated. Now, for this, you can use medical arguments that we don't want to spread contagion, but they didn't use medical arguments. They used arguments from church history. So just a little bit of data. In 1920, the Christian missionary organizations were taking care of about 5,000 patients out of around 9,000. So a huge proportion. Right. So what are the consequences of this kind of approach? You don't have the latest medical interventions. Now, that doesn't mean only no medicine. It also means you don't do proper diagnosis. So we don't really know how many of the patients actually had leprosy. They might have had yaws, syphilis. Were they being treated for other things? We don't know. Um, okay, now I will just take, because this is a general talk, I'm going to take now some two specific institutions, very different in nature, run by missionaries, to show you what is the impact of this bibliotherapy. I'll just sort of narrow the focus now that we've talked about the institutions, we've talked about the state. And I would give one word of caution. Do not homogenize the missionaries. There was a huge amount of diversity. So the first is Mary Read of Chandnad. She was something of a heroine. She was in the Chandnad asylum. Lots of books were written on her by the missionaries, sold all over the world. These are the books Zachary Gassau would have read. Now, Mary Read is very interesting because you have a woman missionary superintendent. I think she was the only one. And she herself found out in 1890 that she was suffering from leprosy, which she contracted not in India, by the way, but in the USA. Now, it makes no impact on her duties in her institution. It was a leprosy institution. There was no medicine. There was only, as I've explained, teaching, male-female segregation. So when she gets leprosy, does she withdraw herself, especially from children? No. She says, 6 months into her illness, in addition to my duties in the asylum, I now have 6 village schools, 3 Sunday schools, and 6 pupils at home every week. This is in one of her letters in 1893, which you can get in various missionary archives. So, she has leprosy. She does not put any restrictions on herself, and this is the time when the missionaries are saying, let's have separate homes for untainted children to save them from contracting an infection. Now, what do the missionaries say about Mary Read? Do they say, oh, she should stop her teaching, she should stop her reading, she should stop her reading practices, bibliotherapy? Oh, no, they don't. They say that this is God being manifest in her. So obviously, by 1910, when George Jackson wrote this book on her, by 1910, the missionaries are not really thinking of leprosy as an illness caused by a bacteria. So whatever Armour Hansen said in 1909, he actually declared in the Bergen conference that if there's no bacteria, there's no leprosy, so you get a microscope and do the test. Nothing of that till 1930. Okay, so this is one instance of an institution where the primacy is given to baptisms, and she said so, and to reading and to teaching. Now, I'll give you one more example, and then I'll move to my next section. Now, this is a very interesting nanny leprosy asylum in Allahabad, and the superintendent is Sam Higginbottom, friend of the Nehrus, friend of Gandhiji. And why it's unusual is he and his wife, they challenge the missionary ethic. They say we're not going to separate male and female. And he doesn't say so openly, but I found out from various archival sources that their home is a haven for young couples with leprosy who run away from other asylums and come to nanny. And then they say we will allow marriages. Now, why is this important? This is important because this is a medical institution. Now, in 1920, the new medicine for leprosy, the new approach had been instituted. You can look at the data. In 1924, there was an inspection by the DC, by the medical officer. They said, yes, it's one of the best institutions in the country, one of the best run. And by 1928, they have what? 7 adults and 18 children in the early stages cured and discharged. So it's a medical institution. But even in a medical institution, the debates are not medical. They're being decided according to church law. So the Mission to Lepers, who runs this home, they do an inspection and they say, what on earth is going on? 23 births, so many marriages, the rules are being violated. Now, Higginbottom argues back. He says, it is an ethical issue. Now, I'll quote you. This is from the archival sources again. The policy that you, the Mission to Lepers and the Presbyterian Church are following is, to my way of thinking, unscriptural. What God has joined together in marriage, the Mission to Lepers may not part. So he's not saying that, look, there's medical evidence. Some of them are not infectious. Some of them are. We're following medical things. It's the church law. And every marriage is a Christian marriage, and there are baptisms. And Gandhi comes and visits and sees all of this. And I think it has an impact on his own discourse. So Gandhi came, Pandit Nehru came, many of them came. And Dr. Norman Foreman showed them around. Dr. Norman Foreman was one of the most important missionaries, an MD from Trenton State in the USA. And he ran these charitable dispensaries, Jamuna dispensaries in Allahabad. So Norman Foreman is silent, isn't he? So all the debates in what appears to be a medical institution, nobody will question the Christian teaching, which boils down to bibliotherapy. Now, I want to end this section with a little bit on what is the nature of this teaching, because it'll end by 1920. This is just one phase. Now, I will read you just a little bit. There's one article. There was a report in I beg your pardon. There was a conference in 1920 in Calcutta, organized by the Mission to Lepers, a medical conference. And here, Mr. W.C. Irwin gave a talk on Christian teaching. Now, here we will find out exactly what is the nature of bibliotherapy. And as I said, it's not an innocent act. Now, if you read to me, do I have a choice? If you choose a text, something else is being displaced. Has anyone asked me? So all these are actually political acts. Now, he says, the main aim of the Mission to Lepers is to preach the gospel to the lepers and relieve their dreadful sufferings. 2, soul and body in that order. So, we should have a balanced view. And then he says, there is a danger of letting the secular swamp the spiritual. So he's really worried that these new medical ideas, these new medical treatments, these new diagnoses of leprosy, they're going to shake up the primacy of spiritual teaching. So he says, we have a golden plan. The majority of patients that come to our asylums are usually illiterate and very dull intellectually. So I really think we need to now modify our whole concept of bibliotherapy in a country where you have people, all of them are not literate. It need not be reading, it may be being read too. With such, the golden plan of line by line and precept by precept is absolutely essential. I'm a great believer in expository teaching. So this is how I'm going to do my bibliotherapy. And the next paper in this conference, and you may be surprised, it's a public conference, it's a medical conference, and that's how it was in 1920, by the Reverend Cannon, preparing converts for baptism. And it's the same thing, that it's an illness of the soul, and we will give emphasis to Christian teaching. Now, one point I want to say is that most of the institutions did not employ coercion. We must make that point. It was just a general environment. And some of them, like Mary Reed of Charnock, she was very clear that if we have coercion, then patients will not come to us. So we have to be very careful not to have coercion. All right. So how can we sum up this section? That it's amazing in the case of leprosy. I can think of no other comparable example where the prime mode of treatment for these last 5 decades, 1870 to 1920, is bibliotherapy. And now in 1922, committed people, one officer of the Indian IMS, Sir Leonard Rogers, and one medical missionary, Dr. Edwin Muir, they set out to secularize leprosy and transform the institutions for leprosy. So now there's going to be a clash between the spiritual and the secular, and we have to get this very clear. It is led by medical missionaries. In fact, this next period of 20 years, I would call it the era of Dr. Dr. Edwin Muir. So now what do they say? They say that leprosy, the earliest stages are what we're looking at, when it's just a patch on the skin, not the deformities. Most of them are not infective. Catch them early, all leprosy is not infective. Now, what does this do to the missionary thinking that, hey, we are looking at deformities, disabilities, ulcers, manifestations of sin, all that's gone. Now you need a microscope. Now, those who are not infective, they can go home, they can marry, they can do what they want. So this is going to really attack the whole structure of this institution. It's going to create new bibliographies and what will happen to the existing bibliotherapy. Now, I want to give one line of Dr. Edwin Muir. It's an external audit they do in 1920 of all the asylums, which I told you are mostly not medical institutions. He says, the chief difficulty in carrying out our researches and experiments successfully was that in many leper asylums, there were no qualified doctors. So this is my whole argument that they are primarily institutions for bibliotherapy. Now, Sir Rogers says that all of this, it has little effect in reducing the disease, and in my opinion, is largely money thrown away. So these are indeed radical statements, and they pave the way for a new generation of thinking. I just want to spend 1 minute more because, time is fleeting. And I want to look at why does this bibliotherapy continue in some form or the other? And the answer is, just switch the light on. The answer is simple, because nobody questions it. Now, in 1925, Muir, Dr. Edwin Muir and Sir Leonard Rogers publish a book. And to my mind, this is the first time they're asking, biblical leprosy, is it the same illness as we're now calling leprosy? And in a very cautious way, this is a textbook which is read all over the world, they say, there's a section on biblical leprosy. So it's the first time that they will say that, that illness and this illness are not the same. I quote, there has been much controversy regarding the true nature of biblical leprosy. For what is the description in the Bible? Leviticus, the book of Leviticus, the disease is described as being highly contagious yet readily curable and producing the appearance of white as snow. Is very far from being correct as applied to leprosy as we know it now. So what are they saying? That illness in the Old Testament, Zarat, could have been any kind of defilement. It could have been any kind of skin cancer, any kind of skin ailment. Why are you connecting that illness with this illness? What does it mean? It's a patient. It's a bacteria, not a sinner. But they don't go further than this. They're very cautious. And if you look at the Indian publications of Belra, they're completely silent on this. So nobody really dialogues with the missionaries and says, why don't you drop it? Now, from 1927, there's a new intervention. So let me just pause. I don't want to just take an ahistorical view and say, there's a certain kind of reading practice in the institutions. I want to say, there's a certain state policy, colonial India. There's a certain medical understanding of leprosy, which doesn't always filter into India. Because in India, the discourse has its own momentum and huge numbers of patients. You can't confine 100,000 patients, okay? So it's modified. And within this, you have an institution and a certain kind of therapeutics. Till 1920, very little medicine, mostly bibliotherapy. Now, 1927 is the foundation of BELRA, the British Empire Leprosy Relief Association. It's not a charity. It's a secular, collaborative enterprise between the state, between the princes who fund it, between Indian doctors, and it's led by medical missionaries. And one of the chief figures here is Dr. Isaac Santra from the beautiful state of Orissa. And he's one of the key influences on Gandhi. So now they say It's an illness. We will go to the village. We will have a new alternate. We will have a different kind of brochures and pamphlets in regional languages, lantern lectures. You have a lantern and a slide and you show it in the villages. So they generate alternative texts and alternative bibliography. And they produce simple medical books. One of them, Edwin Muir, Leprosy. You know why it's so important? It was widely disseminated and Gandhiji picked it up. And in 1935 or so, Gandhiji says, hey, I read it, I like it, and I show it to everybody. So Gandhiji is now going to get into the missionary secular agenda of Belra. Okay. So what happens now? Now you're going to have different modes of bibliotherapy. You have a very aggressive Belra, you have Dr. Muir, you have Dr. Santra going from state to state, asylum, village to village, creating an alternative. So what's going to happen when the secular and the spiritual collide? And what happens is that the missionary institutions become medical institutions. So let me just give in one line an overview. If we're looking for a sort of meta-narrative, it is of the secularization of leprosy, which is now happening. And I will quote Dr. Isaac Santra because, I really feel that his contribution was enormous. And he was the first Indian leprosy specialist of great repute. Yesterday, I think Dr. Katoch talked about Dr. Dharmendra. He was also very eminent. So Isaac Santra wrote in the Leprosy Review 1931 about how the institutions have changed. So now the institutions are changing, the missionary institutions. What will happen to the bibliotherapy? And he writes, within the last 5 or 6 years, it is wonderful how many asylums have been transformed into hospitals and how readily some superintendents have attached leprosy clinics to their institutions. Now, what has changed? Earlier, we saw leprosy as a disease of the soul. No matter what else you say, Jackson said, George Jackson was a very senior functionary in the mission to leprosy. He says it's a sin, whatever else you may say. Now, what is Isaac Santra saying? 1931. He says, the Christian missionaries worked for this, I quote, because they believe, I quote, that the ministry of healing is an essential part of the work of the Christian church. So now there's a change in perspective. From reading therapy as primary, now the medical side is primary, and this reading is additional, which will continue because it's never challenged. Okay, now I'll just give you one example of the consequences of this kind of practice. What happens to the patients? Now, these were not total institutions, so patients could leave. Segregation was never really imposed in India. Patients have a choice. You don't like it, you leave. You find some place to go. You go to Naini, you go to Allahabad. And one of the major asylums, the showcase asylums, was Purulia, now in Jharkhand. And a lot of the patients who were unhappy with the religious environment in Purulia, this Reverend Cannon's paper, which I read out on how to prepare patients for baptism, he was from Purulia, run by the London Missionary Society with the mission to lepers. Now, what happens is, I will read you a very nice article called The Naba Kushta Nibasa in Purulia by Mr. Jimut Bahan Sen. And he says, I live in Purulia, and we have a lot of patients going to the asylum. And after some time, what we find is that they're spilling all over the city because they are a little bit concerned about the state of the asylum. Just give me 1 second, and I'm going to find you the quotation. Here we are. So he says, this leprosy home, Purulia, this is really a counter discourse. It's a community-funded leprosy home in Purulia, a stone's throw away from the missionary home. So this home is now in the hands of the Mission to Lepers, which gets substantial government grants, but the missionaries' preoccupation has always been proselytizing. And in the hands of over-enthusiasts, it has now got more emphasis, and public health aspects are neglected. This institution draws patients from all over India, but discrimination and fear of conversions threw a large section of these lepers on the town. And under the guidance of Dr. Muir, we opened 3 outpatient clinics, and now we've opened our own home where we let them marry, we let them go home occasionally. It may not be wise, but it's the only way to keep things going. Marriages have been allowed and sometimes marked with great celebration. So now what's happening? And the date of this article, I really must tell you, is 1943. So one of the consequences of having an institution where you carry on a practice which, the times are changing, is that the people come out with an alternative institution. So now I want to spend the rest of the time talking about Gandhi. Gandhi is very important to any study of leprosy in colonial India. Gandhi was involved with leprosy from his childhood. And the first reference he says is an anecdote in his autobiography. He says, as a child, there was this spiritual teacher called Ladha Maharaj, and he had leprosy. And how did he get cured? So this first childhood memory of Gandhi is on leprosy is ironically, and I myself am amazed at how pervasive is bibliotherapy across cultures. He says he read to his ailing father passages from the Ramayana. It was said of him that he cured himself of his leprosy not by any medicine, but by applying to the affected parts bilva leaves and by regular repetition of Ramayana. So chanting the name of Ram, so the spiritual teacher would come to Gandhi's father who was ailing and chant the name of Ram. Read here, I think this would refer to Ramcharitmanas, and he got cured. So Gandhi's introduction to leprosy also starts with bibliotherapy. Now, beyond this, Gandhiji, when he was a child in India, the medical thinking was modern medicine, colonial medicine, that is hereditary. Then when he went to England as a student, that was in the 80s when bacteriology was everywhere. Okay, 1860s to 1880s, the older theories were thrown out, and this is the era of bacteriology. So what does Gandhi pick up in England is a bacteriological understanding of leprosy. And throughout now, when he comes back to India from 1925, the first asylum he visits again is in Orissa, Cuttack Asylum. And then he goes to Purulia and he sees the latest medical treatments for leprosy. Now, why I'm making this point is that what Gandhiji learns from the missionaries, and he has a long relationship with Sam Higginbottom, with Donald Miller of the Mission to Lepers, and with Dr. R.G. Cochrane of the Church of Scotland Missionary Society, with Dr. Isaac Santra, with so many others. What Gandhiji learns from the missionaries, and Dr. Santra was not a missionary, is the secularization of leprosy. So missionaries stigmatized. Everyone didn't believe it. Missionaries secularized. Now, the second point about Gandhi is that while in South Africa in 1908, he writes an article in his journal, Indian Opinion, on a leprosy home in India called Chandkhuri, which is now in Chhattisgarh. And he says, I've got here a brochure of the missionary. So look at the power of these brochures and publications. So you have an act in India or whatever, and it's written about and it's going all over the world. It's going to South Africa, it's going to Britain, it's going to America. It's really amazing the extent of this impact. Now he says, this is the brochure, Indian Opinion, 11th April 1908. He refers to an account we received of a lepers hospital. We don't hear of anyone among us coming forward to give them medical treatment or build hospitals. The task of bringing medical aid to them is left to the whites. So very, very clear that this is the Chandkuri was one of the few asylums which had wonderful laboratories, medical infrastructure. Purulia, Chandkuri. There were some, 6 or 7 out of many. So what is the aim? The aim is undoubtedly to convert to Christianity the victims of the disease, but no one is sent away for refusing to be converted. So please note, Gandhiji always gets to the core. And what I want to say about Gandhi, I'm not talking here about Gandhi's discourse on leprosy. I'm not talking about Parshode Shastri. I'm talking about the Gandhian institutions for leprosy, because I've really focused a little bit more this time on institutions. Okay, so now the missionary institutions are becoming secularized. They're becoming like hospitals by the 1930s. They are hospitals, but the reading practices continue. They're not dominant, but they continue. The only difference between the Gandhian institutions for leprosy and the missionary institutions is one difference. Gandhi gives religious freedom, no bibliotherapy. And the second difference also, of course, is Gandhi's own imprint. Everyone spins and all that. So let me quickly tell you a little bit about the Gandhian institutions for leprosy. Now, what's happening is all the studies on Gandhi, I think they focus too much on the online portal. Everything's just a click of a mouse away, so no one's looked at these institutions. Now, I'll look at one institution, the Maharogi Seva Mandal. It was founded in 1936 in Wanda, which is just a few kilometers away from Sevagram. If you sort of nip through the woods, it's just a short walk, 5 or 6 kilometers. Now, what has Manohar Devan done? Why is Gandhi so happy with him? When he visits his home in 1944, you know what he wrote in the visitor's book? I am not the real Mahatma. Manoharji is the real Mahatma. Now, what he did was he made an institution for modern medicine. So point number one, all those scholars who tell you that Gandhi was against modern medicine, they haven't studied leprosy. Now, he founded this institution in 1936, and Gandhi immediately told him, you go to the best missionary institution, Chandkuri, Purulia, and you check them out and learn their best practices. Number two, he said, you go into a course at the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine, which is run by Dr. Edwin Muir. And Gandhi is an admirer of Dr. Muir. He reads his book, he sends it to people. And I've got a lot of data to prove that it's a medical institution of modern medicine. Look at the letter of the Deputy Commissioner of 1938. Again, these are all archival stuff, very fragile archives. So if this kind of work is not done in the next few years, I think the archives will vanish, which is why I'm doing it now. And I hope a lot of you also take it forward. So he says they have a main ashram. They have one at Yela Keli, where they have 180 patients. They survey the villages. This is the Belra agenda. Dr. Muir, Dr. Santra, Dr. Dharminder, Dr. Cochrane. And more doctors visit it, meet the Dr. Mahodai over there. And let me just skip a little bit. I have this huge section on how it is a medical institution, which I'm going to skip for now. But I'll just give you one quotation of Dr. Tharani, Director General Health Services, who goes and says, I'm amazed how well it's doing and how well it's done. Grown. Now, Bibliotherapy. Manohar Devan brings out a book called Maharog, 1940, Warda. Selling price 12 rupees. And he says it is a compilation of 2 books by Dr. Edwin Muir and by the lecture notes of Dr. Lowe. Dr. Lowe is one more missionary doctor, but it's in Marathi. So this is the first medical textbook in Marathi. Now, Dr. Katoch mentioned Dr. Dharminder yesterday as one of the great leprosy specialists of the 1930s. So I dug out a book review of this book by Dr. Dharminder. And he says, on the whole, it is a well-written book, but he says, now he's looking at the audience of this alternative text, alternative bibliotherapy. So are you going to do spiritual teaching or are you going to Tell the patients, you have an illness, all of you are not contagious, some of you stay for treatment, rest of you go home, come after 6 months, it's not a sin, it's an illness. And let me tell you that the missionaries were not the only one who stigmatized leprosy. There was a huge amount of prejudice in India already. In fact, I would say in India, this theory of missionaries stigmatizing completely breaks down in this context. So let me just tell you now, because time's running out. Dr. Dharminder says, the object of this book, the author states its object to produce a book on leprosy in a popular language with school teachers in view and not for medical men. But the author has gone too far into technical details. Why has he made it so technical? So they're discussing this alternative bibliotherapy. And I would say that what Gandhiji has now is an ideal missionary in Manohar Dewan. Gandhiji has not secularized leprosy alone, he has spiritualized it. So they don't have freedom, they have respect, they're short of money like all the missionary institutions, hard up, short of money, struggling, but they give respect to the patient. Now, by this time, the missionary institutions are totally medical institutions. Little bit of bibliotherapy carries on. So I'm winding up now. In 1931, the leprosy conference in Manila, they said, don't use the word leper. It has too much stigma. Now, the mission to lepers only changed their name to the Leprosy Mission in 1936. So this is the pervasiveness of one way of looking at a patient and an illness. And it is a matter of wonder how pervasive is the stigma. Now, let me just end, not with Gandhi's life, but Gandhi's afterlife. Now, after his tragic assassination, the Gandhi Smarak Nidhi was formed, and this led to the formation of the Gandhi Memorial Leprosy Foundation in Wardha, and Dr. R.V. Wardekar, who's supposed to be the farmer of modern Indian chemotherapy for leprosy. Now, he says, I don't believe in all this compassion. I don't believe it's compassionate and humanitarian. Leprosy is a communicable disease and its control is important. So what does it mean? That it's not that we will keep the homeless, keep the deformed, keep the destitute. We're only going to keep infective patients. Our focus is on infective patients. And the missionaries say, where will they go? And Gandhi says, where will they go? So the Gandhian institutions and the missionary institutions both say that we can't just look at control. We need a more kind of humane approach. So let me sum up. It is incredible how pervasive is bibliotherapy. Leprosy shows us it's not an innocent action. You choose one text, you displace so many more texts. Now, it could have been that in 1870, when the asylums were opened, the missionaries did this amazing work. And Dr. Shushila Nair repeatedly says, I'm Gandhi's personal physician, nobody else is doing it. Excuse me. They could have said, okay, we have the Norwegian text on leprosy. They could have said in the 1870s, that the 1880s, that there's so many new medical texts. 1890s, Hansen's book, Hansen and Luft. 1898, I'll end with Manson's Tropical Disease. This book had a canonical status in India. Gandhiji talks about it. In 1945, in Harijan, Dr. Shushila Nair quotes it. So there's lots of modern medical textbooks throughout the period from 1850 to 1950, which could have been cited, but the entire situation was such that there's a certain kind of reading which is prescribed, certain medical texts are displaced, one generation of medical missionaries pushed for one kind of reading, a second generation, mostly medical missionaries. Sorry, the first was lay missionaries. These are medical missionaries. They bring in an alternative scientific reading, but don't challenge the earlier bibliotherapy. So they kind of coexist. And right now, again, I would say with MDT, these things were talked about yesterday by both our Dr. Patoches. The ultimate triumph is of the secularization of leprosy. Yeah? My time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for such an interesting and informative talk. With this, we move to the question answer session. The first question to you is, could you throw light on the kind of texts that were being read to leprosy patients? The kind of literary texts, I mean.
You know what literary texts were being read to them? They were being read parts of the Bible. That was the prescribed bibliotherapy, and it was very well organized. Are you talking? I'm talking only here about the missionary asylums. The other homes were not so well run generally. And it's only in the 1940s that we're actually talking about fine arts and a library. That was not there earlier. So I would say that there was no alternative reading. It was the life of the apostles, the life of Christ, Leviticus. It was religious teachings. Okay, and what Gandhiji did was he did not exchange that with one more set of holy books. That was Gandhi's great spiritual heroism.
So you said why during your talk that Gandhi spiritualized leprosy. What exactly do you mean by that?
You know, that's a lovely question, and I can do a whole talk on Gandhi and leprosy, but I had to bring that in. When you look at Gandhi's early reference to leprosy in Indian Opinion 1908, there's a bit of mysticism, okay? That article is titled Lepers' Blessings. And he says the British get blessings from leprosy. So there's a bit of mysticism. Now, when Gandhi comes and he sees the huge prejudice, and there's this new scientific understanding of leprosy, he starts to take that and talk about it. You can say Gandhi's alternative text was Harijan, where he keeps talking about these things. Now, when you look at his institutions, it's not just the institution of public health where you have a blood test and you say, all right, you are infective, you come in, and you are not infective, you may have deformities, you may have any number of problems, out you go. He doesn't take the modern scientific approach to leprosy. He takes the spiritual approach that we'll treat everyone as a valuable soul, we'll keep them here. They will all spin. Now, spinning, is it a cultural act or is it also a spiritual act? Because everyone's doing it in a sense of offering, no coercion, and a great sense of respect. So a lot of the patients who are outcasted, thrown out of their homes, they get, a chance for respect. And when they die, they have all the mantras, all the pujas, no coercion, freedom of religion.
Thank you, sir.
So that's what I meant by, okay, fine.
We move to the next question. Have there been instances of conflict among missionaries and doctors who were not missionaries?
Have there been conflicts among missionaries? I gave you the example of Higginbotham, Sam Higginbotham, who was very larger than life. He's written an autobiography. There were a lot of conflicts which didn't come out in the open. I found out a lot about Sam Higginbotham from the Presbyterian Missionary Archives. And it was quite out in the open that he's defying the rules of the church. And his wife had conflicts. She wasn't behaving like a missionary wife. She was the one who was really helping these patients get married, have an alternative life. And she told Gandhi about it. And Gandhiji wrote in 1935 that Mrs. Higginbotham has told me that patients can marry. So, it's not just one central conflict, but there are many beneath the surface. Okay, so there were some conflicts. Not that many, but a lot of free thinking. What was the second part of the question?
I repeat the question. Have there been instances of conflict among missionaries and doctors who were not missionaries?
What happened was that all along people are saying that very few doctors are willing to come into leprosy work. And the way I see the workings of Belra, it was very democratic. It was dominated by Indians. it was led by Dr. Muir, who had this great reputation, Dr. Santra, Dr. Dharminder. They used to criticize, they used to argue, they brought out a journal called Leprosy in India. So there was a lot of discussion, but I think there was a sense that we have to be in this together. Now, if you're asking me, did anybody come straight out and challenge the Christian character of the institution? There were no alternative institutions. This is what Gandhiji keeps saying. Why don't you take responsibility? And one example I gave you was of this Naba Pushta Nibasa, where the people took the initiative. Most of the doctors by 1935 were Indians, whether they were Christians or not. And just one last thing. Mary Reed, Chandnag, 1930, Dr. Masi, it was an Indian Christian doctor who stood up and said, hey, Mary Reed was a very nice person, but she didn't give them medicine. So there was a lot of discordant voices.
Thank you, sir. Next question is, in the book by Miss Hayes called My Leaper Friends, an account of personal work among leapers and of their daily life in India, Miss Hayes shows pity for the European leprosy patients for sharing roof with the Indian patients. Can you please comment on the difference in treatment, if any?
This book I read a long time ago. I can't go into details, but I can tell you that many of the missionary homes had foreign patients, they had Hindus, they had different castes, and all of them, by and large, wanted to cook separately, eat separately. And missionaries used to complain that we give the food for the Christmas dinner, but we're not allowed to cook it. So there was a lot of accommodation going on between different groups. Yes, there were European patients. And let me tell you that the medical treatment was so good, offered by the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine. A lot of international patients came. Now, it depends where you are. Gandhi's Maharogi Seva Mandal had people from Africa. They had people from different countries coming as patients. There was no discrimination. Generally, European patients were given separate accommodation. Irish women and all kinds of things. If you're asking me, was there a hierarchy? Were there discriminatory practices? Yes, of course.
Okay.
What were the Indians doing? Gandhiji says.
Moving on to the next question, which is slightly connected to the first. Before the arrival of missionaries, were there any asylums for leprosy patients? Some articles suggest that people with disability and leprosy were allowed to beg for themselves. Were there any provision for treatment by the Hindu societies and groups?
There were dharamshalas where they could be kept. The first home for leprosy patients, as research shows, was made in Banaras in about 1825, funded by the Raja, and he asked Christian missionaries to run it. Now, I will just tell you that Dr. Isaac Santra, because you are in the beautiful state of Orissa, he wrote an article in Harijan around 1945 for Gandhiji, and he says, a lot of the temples had this tradition because patients would go there hoping for cure. They could bathe in the pond and they would be fed. And he mentions by name South Indian temples. I don't have the reference here. He mentions by name temples in South India where they feed them. So there was some alternative arrangements. But if you're saying, were the leprosy patients in India a cared for group? No, they were not. Gandhiji repeatedly says that it's because of the curses of these patients that the British have an empire, and because they are looking after the patients in India that they get blessings. So there were various asylums and dharamshalas, but let's be clear. By 1880s, modern medicine has become so well entrenched, this is what David Arnold has said, that when you start the modern medical treatment diagnosis, nobody's looking at other alternatives. Modern medicine has become well entrenched. And there were charitable homes and dharamsalas and a lot of local Indians giving money, but a lot of them gave money to the missionaries. They gave land, they gave money, more collaboration.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we have two more questions for you.
Sure.
One is, Was there institutionalization of disability prior to establishment of leprosy asylums?
Was there anything for disabled people? Is that the
Yeah,
question?
yeah.
Well,
Institutionalization of disability
I
prior to
don't
the establishment of leprosy asylums.
I don't see any specific centers for the disabled, but in the dharamshalas and the poorhouses and all these things, all kinds of people would be clubbed together. Leprosy hadn't got a separation. In fact, if you look at the census of India from the 1870s, leprosy is clubbed with insanity. So, epilepsy, huh? It's not really separated. And it's very difficult to know who has leprosy, who has deformity due to leprosy. So, at the local village level, this I want to say, when Isaac Santra begins his leprosy surveys across India in 1927, he was in charge of the survey party, going village to village. And he found in some villages there was a lot of care for patients, care for people with deformities, and they could stay in the village or on the outskirts of the village, they would be looked after. In some places, there was none. So we should not think only urbanly in urban terms of urban institutions. There was a great deal of regional variation. Yes. Was it anywhere near adequate? No.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, why do leprosy patients even today prefer to run away from the state-run asylums? You have discussed about it briefly in one of your research papers.
I was talking about uprisings in the 1930s. What happens is that modern medicine liberates the patient. This is what we learned yesterday from Dr. Kadoch. Modern medicine liberates the patient. So in the 1930s, you have outpatient clinics. You don't have to be locked up in a home. You can go home, you can have your treatment, you can have more of a normal life. So people get more assertive. People have much more self-esteem and they're much more empowered. Now, I don't see anybody wanting to break out really in India because, except for very few examples, segregation was not enforced. And where would they go? Now, those who want to leave would just leave and travel, go to temples, sit on trains for free, and travel around, go great pilgrim travelers. Huh? So the breakouts were few and far between, and they were generally the missionaries were very concerned regarding the government homes. They might not be happy with the way they were run, with the food, with the medical treatment. That might be it.
With this, we come to the end of the question answer session. We thank you so much, sir, for your patience, for your time, and the beautiful talk. Namaskar.
Thank you. I just say one thing, that I'd love you to have a seminar in Orissa, not a virtual one, when this pandemic is over, and call all of us and we'll come.
Zarur, surely, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. Our second speaker for today's session is Dr. Jez Miller. At present, he is a postdoctoral fellow in English and Medical Humanities at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His article titled Medicines of the Soul, Reparative Reading and the History of Bibliotherapy recently appeared in Mosaic, an interdisciplinary critical journal. Another paper by him titled Antinomian Remedies, a Rehabilitative Futurism Towards a Better Life, and Kenneth Burke's Modernist Equipment for Living, was included in a special issue of Modern Fiction Studies in Modernist Fictions of Disability. He is currently working on a book-length project that excavates a link between literary modernism and early 20th century efforts to promote the practice of therapeutic reading. He is also managing reviews editor for The Full Stop. His talk for today is titled Literature and Medicine, from Hospital Libraries to Pandemic Reading, However, we are going to broadcast Dr. Miller's pre-recorded talk, as having him live with us was difficult due to differences in time zones. Questions or queries for Dr. Miller can be sent to the coordinator's email IDs to be specified in the comments section during the streaming. Let us hear Dr. Miller now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jesse Miller. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And today I'm going to be talking about literature as medicine, from hospital libraries to pandemic reading. A couple of months ago, towards the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, I came across an article from the South China Morning Post titled, "What is Bibliotherapy? And how can it help maintain mental health during the coronavirus crisis?" The article begins, "With Hong Kong's self-imposed lockdown, many people find themselves bombarded with news and information, but mental health experts suggest books can help alleviate the stress." The article consists of an interview with a purported mental health expert, a resident bibliotherapist at Ultimate Library's Barefoot Bookshelf of Soneva Fushi, a luxury resort in the Maldives. This bibliotherapist explains the logic behind her literary prescriptions. Reading can be used as an escape during challenging or upsetting times, but it can also make you feel less lonely or shed light on your situation. Reading is one of the best ways of developing empathy and of feeling understood. My advice is to follow your instinct and read books that will either help you contextualize how you feel, relieve the mental pressure of what you are experiencing, or help you understand and process what you're going through. I was struck by this article because of what it says about the role that reading literature can play in fostering well-being, especially right now during the coronavirus pandemic. For myself and for many other lovers of literature, this likely doesn't come as a surprise. Beloved books are an obvious source of consolation, connection, and self-growth in moments of stress and struggle. But it's worth remembering that this is far from the only reason people have spoken about the value of reading in literature. Historical examples include reading for moral instruction, for entertainment, for new knowledge of the world and the people in it, for the development of critical thinking skills, for creative inspiration, for cultural capital, for national pride. Today, in the college classroom and within the pages of academic journals for the study of literature, it's unlikely that you'll find such arguments about the use of reading as medicine guiding practice. So where did this way of thinking about reading literature come from? And what does it reveal about the values that contemporary readers place on the act of reading? Far from a recent phenomenon, the idea that aesthetic experience can be a form of medicine has existed since classical antiquity. Take, for example, Aristotle's use of the medical term catharsis, or bodily purging, to describe the effects that tragic drama could have on the emotions of readers. Still, this belief has not remained static all of this time. For example, for much of the 19th century, cultural authorities fretted over the possibility that reading novels might not be curative, but poisonous. But in the early 20th century, this metaphor of literature as medicine acquired a new significance as a cultural rhetoric that equated the practice of reading with eating gymnastic exercise, and physical health contributed to the shaping of new forms of reading and new institutions, such as the hospital library, in which books were used as technologies of care. In this talk, I'd like to examine the role that librarians in the United States played in the emergence of this new paradigm for treating literature as a form of medicine, a tool for improving the mental health of individual patients and connecting patient readers back to the community of the healthy. By contrast to the forms of reading promoted in the academic departments of literature being established in this same period, hospital librarians treated books not as objects of knowledge, but as technologies of care whose curative potential required specialized techniques of curation. The patient's library movement serves as an example of an emerging therapeutic culture that transposed ethical understandings of the good life to a medical register and expanded the medical frame to encompass such aspects of everyday life as reading. Yet although they imagined their literary clinics as spaces for effecting cure and rehabilitation, at the same time, like contemporary proponents of the medical humanities, early 20th century hospital librarians turned to literature to contest the biomedical model of health from within. As scholars studying the history of reading have long argued, the meaning of texts and the ways they affect readers emerge within historically situated interpretive communities, shaped by the beliefs, assumptions, desires, and power relations of its members, and by the material print cultures which make them possible. Castle and Radway refer to print cultures as encompassing the variety of modes of print production, circulation, and use, approaching print culture not just as a circuit connecting author and reader in a linear fashion, but rather a multiplicity of nodes. They emphasize the range of actors involved in these processes and the range of possibilities for them to achieve personal and collective goals through print, goals that don't necessarily start or end with that of the communication of ideas. In the print culture of the hospital library, these goals were connected to the desire to promote well-being. Through the establishment of new sites of reading, like the hospital library, and new readerly protocols and practices formulated around the desire to promote mental sanity and revitalize modes of existence, the hospital library served as a technology for rehabilitating readers to psychological and social norms, and thus helping them to return to the community of the healthy. Looking back at this history can help us to understand the social function of books and their role in this historically new configuration of knowledge and power coalescing around madness in the early 20th century that continues to shape the way readers read and think about reading today. The practice of supplying books to patients had been developing over the 19th century as part of the moral treatment of mental illness. Opposed to earlier assumptions that mental illness was an incurable physiological phenomenon to be addressed through physical constraint and forced confinement, the moral treatment was espoused by non-medical, typically religiously oriented figures such as William Tuke, Quaker and founder of the York Retreat in England. Proponents of the moral treatment attempted to address the psychological bases of mental illness, attempting to fix the faulty will of the mad through disciplinary practices of moral suasion that often involved cultural practices such as reading, as well as farming, exercise, acting, and building. But the true beginning of the hospital library movement can be found in the early 20th century with the librarian E. Kathleen Jones, the first trained hospital librarian. Jones was hired at the McLean Hospital in Waverly, Massachusetts, the psychiatric unit of the Massachusetts General Hospital, in 1904, which under her direction became the home of the first professionally organized hospital library. She also wrote a number of early books on the practice of hospital librarianship, including 1,000 Books for the Hospital Library, which she published in 1911, and the manual, The Hospital Library, which she published in 1923. In these works, she attempted to tell a story about librarians as wielding power, authority, and knowledge comparable to that of medical professionals. So if the practice of supplying books to patients existed before 1904 with Edith Kathleen Jones, what changes between the early moral treatment movement and the hospital library? One is the shift from the person in charge being the asylum superintendent. This changed to the library staff. There's also a shift in location from the asylum to a broad range of institutions. There's a shift from more of a custodial form of practice to a medical one. There's a shift from the isolated development in various different asylums, mostly disconnected, to a much more organized movement towards the establishment of hospital librarianship. And there's also a change in the way that people were thinking about libraries, from thinking about libraries as a storehouse for knowledge to thinking about libraries as a workshop that includes tools for acting on readers, shaping readers. And these shifts were accompanied by the professionalization of hospital librarians and their strong promotion of their practice, convincing others that books could be seen as a form of medicine. In 1916, the Unitarian minister Samuel McCord Crothers coined the term bibliotherapy in an essay called A Literary Clinic to describe therapeutic reading. One interesting thing about this essay is that it contains an ironic warning against the idea of therapeutic reading managed by experts. He thought that each individual should be in charge of their own cure. However, librarians nevertheless took up this description of bibliotherapy in order to talk about what they were doing. The hospital library movement greatly expanded during World War I, when libraries were established at military-based hospitals to provide books to injured soldiers as a form of entertainment, to help them combat boredom and distract them from their pain. There was a national campaign for book donations accompanied by publicity and propaganda around the patriotic, therapeutic importance of reading. And what this did is it led to an expansion of bibliotherapy beyond asylums and state institutions to a much wider population of patients. Following the war, we begin to see efforts to promote the professional hospital librarian and the practice of bibliotherapy in hospitals of all kind within the United States. The American Library Association led this movement, establishing committees and working to promote the practice, attempting to study and establish the effectiveness of this practice, developing curriculum for training hospital librarians, writing guides for how to establish hospital libraries, determining what kinds of texts are appropriate for patients and what's not, establishing the value of bibliotherapy to the wider public, and setting up standards for hospital libraries and how they should be set up. In advocating for hospital libraries, librarians talked about their work in a very particular way. They used a kind of metaphorical connection that they used to describe the library as an integral part of the hospital. They describe books as medicine, the librarian as a doctor, reading as a form of therapy, and the ultimate aim of their practice as cure. So here you can see just one of many, 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 many examples of quotes by hospital librarians early on in the movement, using this kind of language to talk about their practice. So this is from Elizabeth Pomeroy, who is the director of the Veterans Administration Library Service. So she writes, "In the hospital librarian's zeal to spread the gospel of books, she must always remember that every patient is temporarily more or less abnormal, and the responsibility for the wise choice of his mental food rests with her as surely as the proper preparation of his regular meals rests the dietitian. It must be right in quantity as well as in quality, giving to his mind healthy thoughts and causing temporary forgetfulness of his ailment." So here we can see the way that she's describing the reader as a patient who has an abnormality, and that books are described as a mental food which needs to be properly prepared by the librarian, just as a dietitian properly prepares the correct food for the patient. So this language serves two functions. One is it helps librarians to promote their expertise. So if doctors are already in this period widely seen as experts, worthy of power and authority, and to be taken seriously, by adopting this language, librarians are attempting to accrue that same kind of power and seriousness to themselves. But it's also a language of conviction, what Donna Haraway calls a sensuously lived metaphor, in the sense that this language shaped thought and action. It has certain entailments which define how librarians think about themselves and how they should act, how they think about the books and how they should be read and interpreted, and how they think about patients. So this language frames librarians as caring professionals who must carefully curate books in order to effect the cure of the patient. In describing and thinking about books in this way, they embed into their practice assumptions about what books do and what a good life consists of, which they think of as a kind of normative cultivation of well-being or health, which will make possible the patient's adaptation to and participation in society. For the aspiring hospital librarian, there is a necessity of crafting a new kind of persona, an ethos that combined both professionalism and care. So the hospital librarian is urged to take on a kind of impossible dual role, that of the authoritative professional on the one hand, and the caring, submissive hostess on the other. She must, as one bibliotherapist or one hospital librarian writes, she must combine the wisdom of the serpent with the harmlessness of the traditional dove. Or another example, this one from Elizabeth Pomeroy's guide, ABCs for Hospital Librarians. After emphasizing that hospital librarians must remember that her duty is always to therapy first, rather than improving the reading habits of the patients she serves, she instructs the successful hospital librarian needs more than a knowledge of books and of library methods. She must be sensitively discerning to the feelings of those about her and needs to possess in good measure the humanitarian spirit of helpfulness. She will be pleasing and dignified in manner, tactful and considerate in her contacts with patients, and untiring in her efforts to aid their recovery through the medium of library service. And in addition to these positive traits, she must also never be unreasonably demanding and must avoid a too aggressive a manner. What this reveals is that for the mostly female librarians beginning to work in hospitals, this process of professionalization offers a carefully prescribed degree of authority and autonomy. Expertise is permitted insofar as they continue to replicate the roles that have been afforded to them in the domestic sphere of proper femininity. At the same time, Their role in promoting values of caring, nurturance, and the sustaining of human relationships, their attempts to combine these with expertise, creates a counterbalance within the increasingly medicalized and dehumanizing modern hospital. Importantly, to realize this expertise, the hospital librarian must become a careful reader of patients and of texts. One of the primary ways in which hospital librarians' attitude of care plays out is through the practice of curating texts, determining which texts are appropriate for which readers. So, for example, Miriam E. Carey, the supervisor of institutional and hospital libraries in Iowa and then Minnesota, writes or said in her 1907 talk to the American Library Association, "We believe that what the patients do read can be made as effective for their cure as any remedy employed by the physician. Focused on the book as a tool to be used as what she calls an active agent, whose effects can be observed and evaluated as good or bad only in terms of effectiveness or ineffectiveness, Carey's evaluative criteria, as expressed from the outset, is pragmatist. No intelligent purchase of a book by libraries is made without reference to what the book can do." Carey begins her talk. In making a case for hospital libraries, Carey argues for an understanding of texts that exists in sharp contrast to the Arnoldian ideal of culture as the best that has been thought or said. She describes, for example, the library at Mount Pleasant Hospital for the Insane, the oldest hospital of its sort in Iowa, selected by a gentleman and a scholar who desired to provide the best possible books for his patients, but failed to understand the limited nature of his own taste. She writes, "These books are imported editions of standard authors, principally in fiction, poetry, and essays. They are bound in Morocco and calf, and were published by the most famous houses in London and Edinburgh. They are so beautiful that the 10 Commandments, unless fortified by some visible symbol of the law, would lose their force if the books were to be exhibited at a meeting of the ALA. Yet their incongruity is almost grotesque from the standpoint of books as tools." She emphasizes what the book can do is the sole reason for its presence. Important here is the notion of taste and literary value that is being expressed. Taste here is not on an established hierarchy that interprets all works of culture from a single transcendent standpoint, but rather on instrumentality, with books typologically differentiated based on function and their value determined by reference to the needs of particular readers within particular contexts. Thus, the emphasis on identifying the right book for the right patient is individualizing, in the sense that the text is good if it works for the particular patient. Based on this understanding of the value of books, librarians attempted to develop ways of studying the effects of text on readers through surveys and case studies, and they then transmitted this information to other librarians through book guides. The chart that I have up here on the PowerPoint gives one example of some of the things that a text working means. So we see things like entertaining, calming, increasing self-respect, improving life outlook, but also rendering more amenable to hospitalization, keeping in touch with outside world, improves wholesome viewpoints, and improves hope for future vocation. As the examples from the chart before show, cure for hospital librarians is equated not only with a sense of physical and emotional well-being, but with a desire and ability to adequately perform societal norms. A healthy patient is self-controlled, well-behaved, self-sufficient, a ready and efficient worker, and one connected to the wider social community of the healthy. And this is captured, going back to Miriam E. Carey, by something she says in her talk. She writes, May not the book in state institutions be the tool to weld together warring elements and restore them to society reconciled? Here, the institutionalized are understood in technological terms as parts to be welded back together to operate properly with the rest of the societal machinery. For her, even the insane, who are not, as she says, normal mentality, can overcome the more fundamental social disability their confinement represents through reading. On the one hand, her understanding of which books should be read by these patients is shaped by the goal of rehabilitation. She believes imaginative and sentimental literature, which allows the patient to indulge in interior fantasy, should be avoided, while plain, unvarnished tales which connect the reader back to reality should be used. So what this quote from Miriam E. Carey, as well as the chart from before, demonstrate is an underlying logic of therapeutic reading in the hospital library, which is that of rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is a 20th century concept that revolves around the contradiction between traditional notions of disability and the influx of disabled men as a result of World War I. It reflects a kind of optimism about human malleability and perfectibility, the possibility that the injured can return to a presumed prior normal state, returning to their previous physical or mental integralness, as well as reintegration into a social whole. And what this involves is establishing or identifying certain social norms and making distinctions between normal and abnormal, valued and worthless. What kinds of lives are good and worth living, and what are not, based on those norms. In this sense, the hospital library is a rehabilitative apparatus, a tool for intervening in body and mind and personality to reshape it towards these social norms, using books as the tools that hospital librarians use to achieve this purpose. At the same time, the forms of leisure, pleasure, interdependence, community practiced within the hospital library offer an alternative to the values of the biomedical model of health that predominate in the modernizing hospital, and to the social norm of individual autonomy and productivity that seem to be the end goal of rehabilitation. So while librarians of the Patients' Library movement often describe books as medicine, themselves as doctors, in some ways they saw themselves at odds with the general culture of the hospital. If the patient of the modern hospital was increasingly an object of bureaucracy and science, through the hospital library, librarians attempted to cultivate an alternative set of values that centered on affirming the humanity of the patient. Edith Kathleen Jones, in her Manual for Hospital Librarians, illustrates the supplementary role the hospital library was intended to play as she describes the experience of a patient in a big modern hospital. He has a fractured back and is strapped on a Rogers frame, a torture bed, he calls it. But his mind, as well as his body, is taken care of, since he has the whole world of books at his command in the hospital library. His special favorites are outdoor books, and he can say of them that lying here flat on my back just to read of the good old outdoors makes me forget my troubles. As this passage indicates, Jones believes that the hospital which houses a library can be one that tends not just to the injured body, but also to the injured soul. While the hospitalized patient may be broken, confined, even tortured, reading is a way for him to care for his mind and to forget his troubled body. While on one level the book functions like a medical anesthesia, it also generates a different set of values within the hospital space. It is through proffering this form of pleasurable escape from the hospital that the hospital library transforms the medical model upon which the modern hospital runs, so that in his relation with the library, the patient feels he is a person, not a case or a disability. In this sense, although they imagined their literary clinics as spaces for effecting cure and rehabilitation, at the same time, like contemporary proponents for the medical humanities, early 20th century hospital librarians turned to literature to contest the medical model from within. As I've been describing, over the course of the 20th century, librarians had to fight to advocate for their particular understanding of books as medicine in order for them to be taken seriously. Today, many of the same beliefs about the value of reading can be seen in the way people talk about and share their reading during the pandemic on social media platforms. Where scrolling through Twitter or binging on Netflix is seen as addictive and unhealthy, reading literature is seen as healthy, a form of distraction, escape, and anxiety relief as people quarantine at home and a pandemic rages on. Hashtags such as pandemic reading, COVID reading, and quarantine reading provide ways for readers to share their stacks of books with others. This is treated as a virtuous activity, one worthy of showing off to others as a way of defining one's social identity as a book person. But it also might be seen as a contemporary embodiment of the trope of the literary clinic, in which books are medicine and readers have become both doctor and patient.
We have come to the end of a very interesting session. I would like to thank Professor Sanjeev Kakkar for giving us his time and sharing his experience with us today. Many thanks to Dr. Miller for readily agreeing to speak on the history of bibliotherapy. I hope all the research scholars have greatly benefited from today's session. Tomorrow we will be back again with a new panel of speakers. The title of tomorrow's session is Last Day, Last Words. We have three young and dynamic research scholars for the panel tomorrow. Dr. Robin E.J. from IIT Delhi, Sarah Curie from University of Waterloo, Canada, and Ivy Chua from Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. The speakers will be broadly discussing on their research on medical humanities in psychiatry and palliative care. Meet you tomorrow again at 4:30. Thank you, Professor.